chapter 11, we're going to be building what we call the aggregate expenditures model. This relates back to the expenditures approach to calculating GDP. So we're going to see the same equation here where GDP equals C plus IG plus G plus XN. That will become the aggregate expenditures model. And when we look at the graph, you'll notice that it's the exact same graph that we did in chapter 10 when we were looking at only consumption, but we're going to take the consumption graph and then add in investment, government spending, and net exports. The first thing we're going to do with this model is to find the equilibrium GDP. So you're going to learn the condition for equilibrium GDP and then learn how to find equilibrium GDP from the chart and from the graph. The next thing that we'll do is look at the multiplier. We already learned about the multiplier in chapter 10. We're just going to apply it to the aggregate expenditures graph. As we build the aggregate expenditures graph, we have already talked about consumption and investment in chapter 10. Now we're going to add in net exports, so we're adding in international trade, and we're adding in the government. So we'll go a little bit deeper into both of those topics. And the last thing that we'll talk about are our GDP gaps or our expenditure gaps. And this is when our equilibrium GDP is different from the full employment GDP. The aggregate expenditures model is sometimes called the Keynesian model. And that's because it was first created by John Maynard Keynes. And he created this model to help explain what happened during the Great Depression when the economy didn't recover on its own. It actually got stuck in a deep recession or a depression. One of the main features of this model is that we aren't talking about prices at all. So we're assuming prices are stuck. That means that they're not moving. And we will actually be adding in prices when we get to chapter 12. And this is actually the last time I'll talk about prices in this whole chapter. So we basically are just forgetting about them for now. And like what we talked about in the last chapter, our GDP is going to be equal to the disposable income in the nation. And when we add in taxes a little bit later on in the chapter, you'll see that that will actually change. The way that the aggregate expenditure model works is that we're going to add up all of the spending in the entire nation. So aggregate means adding together, and then expenditures is the spending. And here's the equation that I mentioned earlier that we're already familiar with. So we're going to be adding up household spending, that's consumption, business spending, that's gross investment, government spending, and net exports, which is foreign spending minus any imports that we don't want to consider. Once we have our aggregate expenditures, then we can find our equilibrium GDP. And we'll look at the chart and the graph in a minute, but you're given a lot of potential GDPs. You just want to find the GDP that is equal to aggregate expenditures, which you will have added up from all of the four components. So find the row or the place on the graph where the two are equal to each other, and that is the equilibrium GDP. That is the GDP level that the country will settle at. Now let's take a look at what this would look like. So some of this is repeated from the last chapter when we learned about consumption. This is where we start. So we have our first column that's showing us output and income. So this column is our GDP and also our disposable income. They're equal to each other right now. Then we have our consumption level for each of these potential GDP levels. And we learned how to solve for saving in the last chapter. It's just everything left over that didn't end up getting spent. From here, to find aggregate expenditures, which we're going to get to over here, we're going to look at not only the consumption, but also the investment, the net exports, and the government purchases. We add them all together to get aggregate expenditures. So most of the time, you're not given any of this information over here. You'll be solving for the aggregate expenditures. So I'm going to talk about each of these components for just an overview. And then later in the slides, I'll go into more detail about net exports and government purchases because these are new. Consumption and investment we talked about in chapter 10. So the first thing I want you to notice, that this is a recap from chapter 10, is that as income increases, then consumption increases. So the consumption is always going to rise as GDP rises. Now, if you take a look at investment, notice that this is exactly the same no matter what GDP is. So sometimes they'll just tell you investment is 20 billion. And what I want you to remember is that investment is primarily dependent upon real interest rates. It's not dependent upon the GDP. That's why it's not changing. The next one, net exports. Recall that net exports is exports minus imports. So most of the time, they won't give you the total of the net exports. They'll give you exports and imports, and you'll solve for that. We'll look at that a little bit later. Also notice that exports and imports don't change either. So these are not dependent upon our GDP level. And then the next one, government purchases. This is also constant and it's not going to vary as GDP varies. And that's because the government purchases or government spending is based on the decision makers in the government. So it's going to be based on the Congress's decision. Now let's talk about the steps to finding the equilibrium GDP. Step 1 is going to be to solve for net exports. So you just take your exports minus your imports. In this case, we have 10 minus 10, so our net exports in this country is going to be 0. Step 2 is to calculate aggregate expenditure. So like I said, you won't have anything in this column. In each row, find the consumption, so 375, plus the investment, 20, plus the next net exports, we said was 0, plus government purchases of 20, add them together, you get aggregate expenditures. So in this row, it would be 415. And you'll do that for each row. Calculate the aggregate expenditures from that row. Once you've done that, you can find your equilibrium GDP. You want to remember that equilibrium GDP happens where GDP, that's the first column, is equal to aggregate expenditures. That's the one that you just solved for. So move down each of the rows and compare these numbers here to the GDP until you find the row where there's exactly equal, and it should only happen once. In this example, the only row where aggregate expenditures is equal to GDP is the last row, where our GDP is 550 billion, aggregate expenditures is 550 billion, and that is the answer. So the equilibrium GDP is 550 billion. Now let's take a quick look at the graph and we will talk about the multiplier effect. So in this graph, notice that it looks very similar to what we did in the last chapter when we were just looking at consumption. On the bottom, this has changed from disposable income to GDP. Remember, they're equal to each other, so that's fine. So the bottom is going to tell us the GDP level. On the vertical axis, we have aggregate expenditures. So now, instead of only having consumption over here, we'll add up any of the pieces that we have. So consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. In this graph that we're looking at right here, if you look at the notations next to the lines right here, we actually don't have any government spending and net exports yet. You're not always given all 4 components. So when you're solving for aggregate expenditures, just take whichever components that you're given and add them together. For now, only look at this middle line here. This is our consumption plus our investment. This is our starting place. So I want to talk about first how to find the equilibrium GDP from the graph. And it's very easy to do. You just want to find where your line crosses this 45-degree reference line. So at the 45-degree reference line, that's where aggregate expenditures are equal to GDP. So in this case, then our equilibrium GDP is 470 billion, right at the intersection point between the aggregate expenditures line and the 45-degree reference line. Now let's talk about these two other lines that are on the graph. What they're showing here is that if something changes the investment level, so if investment increases, the whole aggregate expenditure line is going to be pushed upward. So we move from this line to the line that's a little higher when we increase investment. And then they also showed what a decrease in investment would look like. So if investment is decreasing, then the entire aggregate expenditure line would move downward. Think about how this relates to the multiplier effect. Remember what we learned in the last chapter, that the multiplier effect takes an initial change in spending and it causes a much greater change in GDP. So we have an initial change in investment here, and that's shown by this small arrow right here. So investment increased just a little bit. Let's say it increased by $4 billion, and that pushed aggregate expenditure up just a little bit, just $4 billion. When that change happened, it moved our equilibrium GDP. So originally we had an equilibrium GDP right here. When investment increased, now our new equilibrium GDP is right here where the new line hits the 45-degree reference line. And you can see what happened to GDP at the bottom of the graph. So we started with this GDP of 470 billion. Because of the increase in investment of 4 billion, GDP has increased up to 490 billion. And that change in GDP is actually 20 billion. So we have an initial change in spending of 4 billion that causes a $20 billion change in GDP. So think about what that means for the multiplier. That means our multiplier is 5 because that initial change in spending got multiplied 5 times and resulted in a larger change in GDP. So to recap, an increase in investment will cause an increase in aggregate expenditures and a much greater increase in GDP. And a decrease in investment would cause a decrease in aggregate expenditures and a much greater decrease in GDP. Now, let's talk a little bit more in depth into what it looks like when we add international trade. So we're adding in our next component, which is net exports. I mentioned this earlier, but here's a recap about the formula. So you will be calculating net exports by taking exports minus imports. And remember that net exports can actually be positive or negative. So they'll be positive if the country is exporting more than they import, or net exports will be negative if they're importing more than they're exporting, which is true for the U.S. We import more than we export, so our net exports are actually negative. Now let's take a look at the graph. So this graph over here is only graphing the relationship between GDP and the net exports. And notice it's always just going to be even amount. It's not changing. So you'll solve for the net exports. You'll either get a positive number or a negative number, and then in every row you add that amount. Here is what our aggregate expenditure looks like now. So we started out with our economy only having C plus I, so just consumption and then the business spending. This is actually called a closed economy when they're not open to international trade. All countries are open to international trade somehow, so that's not actually very realistic. We always have open countries. Open means open to international trade. So you may see that wording open versus closed in the book. Just realize that relates to international trade. So what they're doing here and showing the change when we add in the net exports, there's two things that could happen. If we have a positive net exports, because we're exporting more than we're importing, then the aggregate expenditure line would increase when we add it. So here's the new aggregate expenditures. Or we could have our aggregate expenditures fall, and that would happen if we have a negative net exports and we're importing more than we're exporting. Either way, you can notice the multiplier effect happening here. So if we're talking about our exports increasing, an increase in exports would push aggregate expenditures up just a little bit, and that would cause a much greater increase in GDP. So you want to keep in mind here what will happen in a country if the amount of exports change. If there's an increase in exports, there will be an increase in net exports, which would increase aggregate expenditures, and it would increase GDP by a much greater amount after we've gone through the multiplier effect. Or vice versa. If there's a decrease in exports, then net exports would decrease, aggregate expenditures would decrease, and GDP would decrease by a multiple. Since we can see the link between increasing our exports and increasing our GDP, I want to talk real quick about things that can increase exports. The first one is prosperity abroad. So our two biggest trading partners are Canada and China. So let's say Canada has economic expansion and their incomes are increasing in Canada. What will happen is that will increase the amount that we are exporting to Canada. So Canada's income is increasing, our exports are increasing, which will increase our GDP. So if other countries, our trading partners, are increasing in their income and their GDP, then our GDP will increase as well. Another thing that can increase exports in a country is the exchange rates of that country's currency to other countries' currency. And some countries, especially China, does this. They depreciate their currency. That makes their goods, their exports, cheaper for other countries to purchase. So it would increase their exports. So one thing that governments need to keep in mind is when they put in trade restrictions like tariffs or devaluation that is specifically trying to depreciate their currency to increase exports, it may cause other countries to retaliate. So other countries may also put in tariffs or try to depreciate their currencies. And these can cause GDP to fall in both countries. And remember that our GDPs are linked because of the exports that we purchase from each other. So if one country's GDP is falling, the other country's GDP will fall as well. The Great Depression is actually an excellent example of this. A recession started in the U.S., and because we were linked through international trade, that recession spread to other countries as well, and it was made immensely worse. It turned into a Great Depression as opposed to only a recession because of all of the tariffs and trade restrictions that were put in. Now let's move on to the last term that we're adding in, which is government purchases. And we call this the public sector. Keep in mind the word public in economics always means government. So what will happen here is we will add in the government spending that will increase aggregate expenditures, and it will increase GDP by a greater amount because we have the multiplier effect. We're also going to look at adding in taxes and how that will change the equilibrium of GDP. Taxes are also subject to the multiplier, but they work a little bit different because what taxes does is it decreases. If we increase the taxes, it's going to decrease the disposable income. And so now disposable income and GDP are not going to be equal to each other. So if we increase taxes, disposable income falls, that's going to decrease our consumption, so it will decrease aggregate expenditures and decrease GDP. Because taxes work in a more roundabout way, they reduce disposable income and then consumption first, then we're going to see that taxes have less of an impact than government spending does, because a portion of that tax cut is saved away as it works through the marginal propensity to consume. We'll get a little more in depth in that in a second. So let's take a look at our graph. We've actually gotten to the final graph, which has all 4 of our aggregate expenditures in here. So remember, we started with just the consumption, we added in our investments, we added in our net exports, and now we're adding in our government spending. So we're increasing government spending. That's increase our aggregate expenditures by this small amount right here. There's our government spending. And when we add in the government spending, we hit a new equilibrium point that increases our GDP by a much greater amount. So there's your multiplier effect, right? Because we have government spending increasing by 20 billion. We have GDP increasing by, looks like 80 billion. So that makes our multiplier 4, because government spending is get multiplied 4 times as much to get our GDP. So government spending is pretty straightforward. We're just going to add it right in, and it's going to add into our aggregate expenditures and GDP. Now let's take a look at taxes, because taxes are a little bit more complicated. So we're looking at the same chart that we looked at earlier. So we have our GDP, we have our consumption, our investment, our net exports, government purchases, and then we add up the C plus I plus net exports plus government spending. That gives us our aggregate expenditures. So not a lot has changed here, except we're adding in taxes. So what's new here is notice that now our GDP is not equal to disposable income. So here's our GDP column. We have a new disposable income column that takes taxes out of our GDP. So disposable income means minus taxes. So because our disposable income has fallen, that's going to cause our consumption to fall. So what we've changed here from the very first time that we looked at this chart is that the government has decided to increase taxes by $20 billion. Now, if we look at the aggregate expenditures and we add up this new C is the one that's changed. So add up the new C plus the I, net exports, government purchases, all of this is the same. The aggregate expenditures actually fell by, in this case, it fell by 15 billion. So because aggregate expenditures is falling, our GDP fell as well. And you can use this chart to find your new equilibrium GDP. Remember, equilibrium GDP is the row where aggregate expenditures is equal to GDP. So look on each row and see where they're equal. Looks like row 7, 490, where GDP is equal to aggregate expenditures. So we increased taxes by 20 billion and GDP fell by 60 billion. Now let's see what it looks like on the graph. So we have our aggregate expenditures, our original here. They are increasing taxes by 20 billion. That causes consumption to fall and aggregate expenditures to fall by 15 billion. And we'll actually work through some of the math on this when we get to chapter 13. We're going to dig more in depth into what the government can do to change the GDP. But notice that the change in taxes causes a smaller change in aggregate expenditures, which when it runs through the multiplier also causes a smaller change in GDP than if we used a change in government spending. So remember what I said, taxes are less effective or they have less of an impact than government spending does. And here's an example for you to try. And there's no taxes in this one, so it's a little simpler. So you're given the GDP and disposable income. You're given consumption, investment, government spending, and exports and imports. The first thing you want to do is calculate net exports. Then calculate aggregate expenditures for each row. Once you have all your aggregate expenditures, then you can find your equilibrium GDP. So pause the video here and find your equilibrium GDP. So I filled in the answers on the table here. Step 1, to calculate net exports, you take your exports, which are 30, minus your imports of 20, and you will get 10 for each row. Then to calculate your aggregate expenditure, you're going to add the info from consumption plus investment plus government spending plus net exports. So 215 plus 10 plus 5 plus 10 will give you 240 for the first row. And you can check your answers here for each of the rows and see if you got the same thing I did. Your last step is to find equilibrium GDP. Remember, the condition for equilibrium GDP is where aggregate expenditures is equal to GDP, which is the first column here. So just move down each row until you find the row where the two are equal to each other. In this row of 400, our GDP is equal to aggregate expenditures, and that is the answer. So the equilibrium GDP is $400. So far, we've looked at everything that goes into finding our aggregate expenditures and how to find our equilibrium GDP. In the next lecture video, we're going to look at what happens in an economy if our equilibrium GDP is too low or too high.